Hello everyone, this is Josh Osowski for PPM 300. This week we're going to be talking about building partnerships. And specifically we're going to be looking at PPPs, otherwise known as public-private partnerships. And as we look at this topic this week, I want you to pay particular attention to kind of the different angles that the different authors take on the need for these collaborations. We're going to see one author thinking it's a good thing and seeing some real hope for this style of management. We're going to see another one saying there's a lot of problems with it and is kind of concerned that it's managed properly, otherwise it doesn't work. And then lastly, we're going to talk about an author who says, well, even though there are pros and cons, it seems like this is the way that management and government is going, and it's something that we need to learn about and try to make better so that it does work. So let's jump right into it with the first article. Tonight we're going to be looking at first the Greater Philadelphia Innovation Cluster for Energy Efficient Buildings, a new model for public-private partnerships, and this is by Foley. And I think this is a really good article. It highlights a best practice that took place, or actually is taking place in Philadelphia, called the Greater Philadelphia Innovation Cluster. And the goal of this PPP is to bring together government agencies, university research centers, and private companies together in order to create ways of retrofitting old buildings and also the construction of new buildings in a more green and energy efficient way. And so as you read the article, especially look at how they structured the organization and the issues and challenges they had bringing the different organizations together. If you think about it, here we're bringing private organizations, college universities, as well as government agencies all together to try to come up with a new system. These three types of organizations don't typically naturally kind of work together, but here is an attempt to do just that. One thing, again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail in this article. I think it's a good article. I think you should read it. But one of the things I thought was really interesting was the way they set up their intellectual property ideas. Basically, this kind of you use it or you lose it idea. So it gives the people who come up with the idea a couple of years to use this new idea. But if they don't, then it's basically general property for anyone to be able to use. I think that's neat because a lot of times we hear about companies and organizations who come up with these really great ideas. They decide not to use them and then they just lock them up in a shelf so that nobody else can ever use them. Lastly, as we're thinking about our projects, again, this whole class is gearing up for this. Next week we're going to be doing, actually the end of this week, Project 1, and then finally at the end of week 5, Project 2. So think about to see if our public-private partnerships a way, an idea for the solution to your problem. They may or may not be, but take a look at this. And I also think that this article has some good insights on the issue in general. But as I said, this article really looks at seeing the future and the possibilities of this. We're going to see in the next article a little bit different take, but I think that's always important. We can always find pros and cons to any issue. This one takes, hey, this is an opportunity. Let's see if we can make it work. In the second article, The Challenging Business of Long-Term Public-Private Partnerships, Reflections on Local Experience by Bloomfield. Bloomfield here takes a look at local governments. And unlike the last article, where they had a positive hope for PPPs, Bloomfield takes a different look at it and really is going to look at the challenges of it. Specifically, Bloomfield says the theory states that PPP should do a couple of things, three in fact. One, they should increase competition, so that way we're going to get better bids that are going to cost the taxpayers less money. Two, risk sharing, so basically a lot of the risk is going to be given to the private entity. And third, that it should improve transparency. However, what Bloomfield's found is that local governments, because of the way that they manage the contracts, really don't get the benefits of these three things. And the reason for that, again, is threefold. Basically, what local governments do is they're treating these transactions more like business transactions instead of true partnerships. Second, the contracts they do create are very complex in nature, so it's difficult to get good results. And third, the contracts are very long term, and we'll see in a little while the consequences of that. But if we first go to the competition issue, what's supposed to take place here when we contract these things out with private companies is we're going to get a lot of companies who are going to want to bid on this. So as a result of competition and everyone wanting to try to get the deal, they're going to lower the cost. However, basically for two reasons, that doesn't really happen in these contracts with local governments. The first one has to do with deregulation. And what this really has to do with is typically, these companies want long-term contracts, maybe 10 years, 20 years. And the problem here is that the laws are written such that they don't really allow these type of contracts. I remember working in the Park Service, we had one contract, it was from a long time ago, that was a 99-year contract. And they just don't do these things anymore because once you have these people in, it's so difficult to get rid of them if they aren't working out right. So laws have been written to really try to reduce that. However, because these companies are going to put a lot of money into building a bridge or a building or whatever the government needs, they need some a substantial amount of time so that they can get back the money that they're going to put into it. So what ends up happening is that these companies, or I should say the public government, basically makes waivers to kind of get around these laws. And unfortunately what happens is that they end up doing no bid contracts. So if you're not going to have any bidding going on, you're not gaining the benefit of competition. Incidentally, also often these contracts are given out to corporations or companies who are politically or well connected. So unfortunately then you also have the whole political impact happening. The second part of why Bloomfield doesn't see competition happening has to do with what is called project-related barriers to competition. And so what happens here is there's things called concession contracts. And what this is a neat little trick where if you win the bid, you're going to give the government a bunch of money up front, basically for it's part of the contract. So let's say you got to pay $1 million once you get this contract. And unfortunately what happens here is that smaller companies may not have that kind of money laying around that they can just dish this out. So again, now you're decreasing the amount of competition for a bid, which is going to only increase the prices. The next problem that Bloomfield sees with the way that small governments deal with PPPs has to do with risk sharing. So ideally, when you build a bridge or you're going to build a new program that's going to cost a lot of money, there's some risk involved. It may or may not work. The cost of a bridge might overrun the budget. There's a lot of things on variables that we couldn't think about at the time, and ends up costing the taxpayer a lot of money. So with risk sharing, you're going to try to give some of that risk to the private company. They're going to be responsible to keep prices in check, and if they don't, they lose out. So you're sharing that risk. However, what often happens is that the risk is transferred from the private entity to the public. So the contract is written where the risk sharing is taken out, and instead of it falling on the private entity, it's actually pushed onto the public, basically guaranteeing the profit that the company is going to make. You can understand why this would be done in small companies. I'm sure it happens in larger ones too, in larger governments and smaller governments as well, because really these people, they want to make money. So they're going to do everything they can to get the contract the way they want it. With smaller governments, it might be easier to pressure them into getting a contract that they want because they're afraid that if they don't do business with this company, they're not going to be able to get their job done. The third problem with the way small governments do PPPs has to do with transparency. So the theory says is that when you hire private companies, there's going to be more transparency, and as a result, things are going to be more accountable. It's going to be done better. It's going to be done cheaper. But Bloomfield sees two problems with this too. One is this thing called innovative financing. So again, this goes back to the whole concessions contracts, where the companies give the governments a lot of money up front. And the problem with this whole thing is it's kind of shady book working, so to speak. Typically, a government, if they want to get large money, they have to increase taxes, or they have to sell bonds, basically incur debt to be able to bring a lot of money in so that they can pay for a bridge or build a new school or whatever it is that they need. But with these concession contracts, it's kind of a little trick where, and in some aspects probably illegal, where they're able to get these concession contracts, get a bunch of money up front, pay for their project. They act like in the publicity that this is a great thing, that the companies give them all this money, so people really jump on board with this. However, the money is basically just a loan, and they have to pay it back throughout the rest of the contract, so it's a problem. The second part of transparency that's an issue has to do with the long-term saving estimates. Perhaps not surprisingly, politicians or the companies are going to exaggerate how much money government's going to save if they go ahead and do this private-public partnership. And when independent auditors take a look at the real money that's going to be saved, often there's a lot of tricks. Things are skewed. Certain costs are left out. Perhaps the increases in revenue are percentage-wise off a little bit, or over-exaggerated or under-exaggerated, depending on what the benefit is. So these really turn out to be problems. In fact, Bloomfield says that from the experiences they looked at, that basically these contracts don't end up saving the taxpayer any money, and often cause the taxpayer to pay much more for the services they could have got cheaper if they just had let the government provide the services as they had. So I mean, the question here is, so what can we do here? You know, if there's all these problems with these private public partnerships, what do we do? And the remainder of that article, which I want you to read, I'm not going to go over in a lot of detail, is she gives practical experience, considerations for planning and implementation, and really the importance of monitoring, which we've already talked about in the last weeks, just how important that monitoring of these contracts are. So please read the article and check it out. There's some good insight there. And next we're going to talk about the third article, Collaborative Public Management, Assessing What We Know and How We Know It, by McGuire. McGuire begins with an interesting concept or framework that we can think about management styles over history. And first, when we think about the agricultural age and we think about the style of governance or leadership that really existed or began with that age, we think of a hierarchical type of structure where people report to a boss and so on and so forth. However, with the industrial age and the increase in technology, we started seeing a different type of government taking place, which was really what we now consider a bureaucracy. And we all know what a bureaucracy is if we work in government, right? Layers of red tape and accountability to make sure that bad things don't happen, that people aren't taken advantage of, people don't steal. You know, just this sort of oppressive type of government, it's very difficult to make anything happen. But all that red tape, you know, was there to safeguard it and to make government more accountable, more transparent. But now, because of the world we live in now, the information age, the problem with that bureaucratic style is it's so cumbersome. It's difficult to be nimble. And so McGuire here says that the most recent type of governance that's really coming around now is what he calls a collaborative management style. And so if we think of collaborative management, it's very similar to the PPPs we talked about in the last two articles. It's dealing with other agencies, be them in government or out of government, to make things happen. And the reason for this change, why he says this is important now, is that bureaucracy is not nimble enough to deal with today's complex problems. And the need to collaborate with multiple agencies is going to become more and more important. Also, people want more out of government. They want more action, but they want government to be less involved. It might seem sort of strange for people to think that, but they want government to fix things but not be too involved. McGuire then goes on further to describe the types of collaborations and the networks that occur when these government agencies get together. He talks about, it's kind of interesting, you start getting these organizations together, they each kind of have their own way of thinking, their own sort of dogma. But what's interesting is when you get multiple agencies to work together, what he calls happens is you get traces of a new organization in space between those that already existed. So you come up with different ways of working, different ways of doing things. Next, he goes on to talk about the management skills needed to make these collaborations work. And here I think is what's really important about this article. It basically breaks this down into 4 different categories: activation, framing, mobilizing, and synthesizing. So with activation, the important thing here is make sure that you get the right people and resources together in the same spot. So you got to find out, all right, what departments, what agencies do we need to solve this particular problem. And when you are thinking about who that is, you really need to think about agencies and departments that have things that you don't have to offer. So you want to find, for instance, you're really good at doing roads, but you're not so good at health. How do you get that health department to work with you to figure out this problem? Second is framing. And here what's important is agreeing to sort of who's going to lead this new sort of organization. Also, the administrative roles of each agency. Who's going to do what? What are the time frames, so on and so forth. And really, I think also very importantly, determine what is the true purpose of this collaboration. You want to set a clear goal. This is what we want to do. It may be a short-term goal, it may be a long-term goal, but you need to be specific, otherwise creep can start to set in, and you can really start to get away from what that initial need for getting all these groups together was. Third is mobilizing, and here you're inducing, what you really want to do is induce commitment by the various members. So now you've talked about what you need to do, but at this mobilizing stage you need to say, all right, we agree, but now who's going to do what, and really come up with the time frames to make sure that that stuff happens. Lastly, you have the synthesizing. And here, here's an important thing. These agencies don't typically work that close together. So what's really important in this synthesizing stage is to engender productive and purposeful interaction in order to build trust and promote information exchange. These are going to be so important. You got to build that trust, get everyone to agree to work with each other, and you might have a chance of really making it work well. Then in the next pages, specifically pages 37 to 39, which I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but McGuire then goes on to discuss some of the important skills that members of a collaboration need to pursue if the collaboration is going to be successful. So spend some time looking at this section, and I guess a good question that you should ask yourself is, do you think he covers them all? Is there anything he's missing? So as you take a look at that, think about those things. So lastly, he looks at the overall positive aspects and also the weak aspects of collaboration. And though there have been many successes, there have also been many that didn't work out at all. And McGuire would argue that what's really important here is, though he sees this as the future and probably what's going to be happening more and more as we're trying to deal with these ever complex issues, how do we make them work? He thinks that academics really need to study this, find better ways to do this, so that we can make them more productive. And so that's really the question. It seems like they're here. It seems like they're what's going to be necessary to deal with the next set of problems in this information age. So how do we make that better? So these are the readings for this week. Please read them, and as you're writing your paper, think about the questions that I've asked. And again, everything that we're doing with these papers and these things that we're reading here are really leading up to the final projects. And the first part of that project is due at the end of this week. So spend some time, start thinking about that. I encourage you to go onto the discussion board and start posting some of your benchmarking or best practices ideas and sharing them with your classmates. and let's get a little network going on so we can come up with some good ideas. If anyone has any questions about anything, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.